Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? My daughter is currently enrolled at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, in the Fine Arts program. And every now and then she brings home a painting that's worth framing. That's what I'm going to make today, a picture frame made from walnut and soft maple. So let's get started. I'm going to make the frame out of 8/4 walnut and 5/4 maple. Now you may think that my daughter is 6 years old or something, but this is actually the back of the painting. I'm just measuring it up for the size, and then I'm going to measure out the lengths on the walnut and the maple. I'm going to cut it oversize. The walnut is going to be 42 inches, the maple 38 inches, and then I'll cut that with a circular saw. It wasn't too difficult to cut, although the blade only goes down 2 inches on my saw, so I just barely made it through the walnut. Now I'm going to use a chalk line to draw a line down the center of both pieces, and that will be the line that I'm going to use on the bandsaw to cut them into two individual pieces. That'll make it the right size, or a small enough size that I can put it on my jointer. I pushed the walnut fairly slowly through the bandsaw because you could feel it working. And then I'll run the walnut and the maple through the jointer. And then once it was jointed, I ran it through the planer. And then I cut the walnut in half. These are going to be the pieces that form the outside edges of the picture frame. And then through the planer again to make sure that they have the same dimensions on all four sides, the same width and the same thickness. And then the maple, I'm going to use this for two purposes. One is a lot of oil on canvas work is framed with an artist's mat around it. So I'm going to use the maple to be that mat. So I'm slicing it down the middle, resawing it so I have thinner slices. And then the other thing I'm going to do is use a little bit of the maple to create an inlay around the frame. So I've got the four pieces, and then I'm going to run them through the planer. And I planed them down to just a little over 1/4 of an inch. I don't remember exactly the size. And now I'm cutting the maple to be the width of the mat that I want to have. Now here what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit of a bevel on the front side. I really should have done this with my insert in the table saw. This was a little bit dangerous, and I was just lazy. I didn't get it out of the drawer, but it would have been safer for me to have that in there. It was a little bit of trial and error to get the right angle. I started at a 15-degree angle, and I ended up doing it in 3 passes. I started with 15, then 10 degrees, and then ended up with about 7 degrees, which gave it a good look. Now here what I'm doing is cutting the strips of maple for the inlay, and the depth of the maple is exactly 3/8 of an inch, but I want it to sit in the walnut to be a little bit proud so I can plane it down. So I'm setting the blade to be a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch. I'll run the walnut through, and I'll do multiple passes to cut the groove or the dado for the maple to sit in. And now for the matte pieces, I've set the blade height to be 1/2 inch and 7/8 of an inch from the edge. That's where I'll start. Use a feather board just to make sure that it's kept right against the fence the entire length. I want this line to be really straight. And again, I do multiple passes. I was just checking it there to make sure I've got it set the right way. Each of these pieces I've marked on them with pieces of tape to know which direction I'm facing, because if I make a mistake, I really don't have any way to fix that. So I did a dry fit, and now I'm gluing up the pieces. First, I'm going to put in the inlay. And that's about 1/4 of an inch by 3/8 of an inch deep. And then flip it over and glue it up for the piece of the mat that's going to go in. And the inlay and the mat don't have to go all the way to the end because I cut the walnut to be oversized purposely, and then I can size it up once those are in. Just tap everything in place, and then I'll clamp it up, and I've got the two pieces facing each other so that the two pieces of inlay will push against each other to help with the clamping. Now I had to go down to the basement. That's where I have a proper workbench, and I'm going to start by planing the inlay. Do a couple, 2 or 3 passes I guess with the plane, and then I'll use a card scraper after that. And this worked really well. I got it very flat, very flush, and then it just required just a bit of sanding at the end. So now I'm measuring up the pieces to get ready to cut the miter joints. And what I'm doing here is I'm cutting off some of the excess material because this piece just barely fit inside my crosscut sled. The crosscut sled is where I have my miter jig installed. So I wanted to cut off all the excess material. Now I'm marking the 2 sides of the miter joint and each of the individual pieces with the letter A or B, because I want to make sure that the alternating pieces are cut on the right side of the jig. When I started, I was just clamping the piece to the jig, but I found that the clamp was causing the material to pull up a little bit and sit on an angle. So I used a 50-pound weight to sit on top, hold it down, and then the clamp just to make sure that it didn't move laterally. Now that all the pieces are cut, I'm getting ready for assembly. Unfortunately, it didn't fit on my workbench. It's just a little bit too wide. This frame is 32 inches wide and my workbench is only 30 inches wide, so I brought down a piece of MDF from the garage, and that made a perfect work surface for the assembly. Gluing it up, I've got some right angle corners to help with the alignment, and then I'll put a framing clamp around the outside. and everything lines up really perfectly. I was really impressed with a piece this large and fairly complex, with the miter joint that extends all the way from the walnut all the way through the maple mat piece. There's a lot of chance for error, but it worked out really well. And then I'm using a couple of pipe clamps just to make sure there's enough pressure on the joint. Now that the frame is glued up, I've got it sitting in a jig for cutting splines, or the grooves for the splines. This is a jig that I made many years ago, and it's worked well for me. It's not a perfect design, but it does the job. So I'm doing multiple passes, and I'm clamping it into the jig just to make sure that everything is really well aligned. I want very straight, very repeatable joints, and then just finishing it up with a chisel. Now I'm making the splines with some leftover pieces of maple that I had from the inlay piece, and I don't have a piece large enough to fit into the spline because I cut it almost 2 inches deep. So I'm going to use 2 pieces of maple, but that'll be okay. It'll look fine as long as there's enough glue in there. You won't be able to see any seam or anything. So I'll put in the first piece. I've got glue on all 4 edges, and then glue up the second piece, tap it into place, and then I'll clamp it to make sure that they're really tightly bonded to each other, to make sure there's no gap. It's really important to use your chisel and really clean out the slots for the splines to make sure you have nice clean lines. I used a Dozuki saw off camera to cut the splines off. And now, after a little bit of sanding, and I did hand sanding around the outside edges of the frame, now I'm just finishing it up with some tung oil finish. Also with some leftover pieces of walnut, I've created some little blocks to hold the picture in place. I will get some figure 8 fasteners to attach to this, but right now a friction fit is holding the painting in place. So there it is. I think she's done a pretty good job with the painting. The frame's not bad either. I'll put a link to her website in the information below.